You didn't wake up to a normal day. You woke up to a new era and didn't even know it. That was the day the West lost control over India. And it didn't make a sound. Not in headlines, not in breaking news, but it happened, and nothing's been the same since. There are moments in history that don't announce themselves with trumpets or fireworks, but they change everything. This was one of those moments. For over 2 centuries, the Western world wrote the script for India. Economically, culturally, politically. From the East India Company to the IMF, from colonialism to neoliberalism, the narrative was clear. India was to follow, not lead, react, not initiate, but that era ended. Decisively, on a day many people missed. And here's the shocking truth. It wasn't the day of a dramatic election or a huge protest. It wasn't even the result of one single decision. It was a psychological tipping point, a silent internal revolution, where India stopped asking for permission and started acting with conviction. Let's be crystal clear. This turning point wasn't just about independence from colonial rule. That happened in 1947. This was something different. This was when India realized it didn't need external validation anymore. Not from the World Bank, not from Silicon Valley, not from the New York Times. It was when India outgrew its imposed limitations and started showing the world that it had outgrown the West's outdated assumptions about it. The West had controlled India through more than just economic levers. They'd controlled the narrative. India was developing, corrupt, chaotic, in need of reform. But suddenly, India wasn't buying that anymore. So when exactly did this shift happen? It wasn't one day. It was a cluster of events and an unshakable rise in national confidence, all culminating in a visible shift in behavior. Take, for example, India's response to global pressure on energy deals. When the West told India to fall in line with their geopolitical strategies, India said no and bought energy from where it wanted, based on its own interests. That's not just foreign policy. That's a power shift. That's a nation saying, we'll decide what's right for us. You no longer get to dictate the terms. Or take India's digital stack, Aadhaar, UPI, and the blazing success of its public tech infrastructure. While Silicon Valley was building for profit, India was building for scale, for inclusion, and it was doing it faster, smarter, and more effectively than most Western nations could dream of. This is where the world began to notice India isn't catching up anymore, it's redefining the game. And that shift, the quiet, firm transition from reactive dependency to proactive leadership, was the real turning point. Because power doesn't just lie in GDP figures. It lies in narrative ownership, in the ability to set the global agenda, not just follow it. Why does this matter? Because once a nation crosses that threshold, it doesn't go back. Once it realizes it can lead, not just follow, it builds a momentum that no amount of external pressure can reverse. And that's what happened. India broke free not just from Western systems, but from the Western mindset. That was the day the West lost control over India. Not because India shouted louder, but because it stopped needing their microphone. This is why that turning point matters, because the day India stopped letting the world define its identity was the day India began defining the world's future. And make no mistake, this wasn't an accident. It was the result of decades of silent progress, cultural resilience, digital innovation, and global assertiveness finally clicking into place. The West didn't lose control over India in a war, a treaty, or a negotiation. They lost control the moment India decided we are not asking anymore. We are acting. And from that moment on, the world order started to tilt. Permanently control isn't just about armies, economies, or sanctions. Control is about the story, the narrative. For over 2 centuries, the West didn't just rule India with weapons or trade. They ruled with a story a story in which India was less than, less developed, less educated, less capable. It was the story that made India a project, something to be fixed, modernized, civilized. That story was embedded into everything, from colonial textbooks to global journalism, from development reports to documentaries, shot through the lens of poverty and chaos. And for decades, the world believed it. Worse, India believed it too. That's how narrative monopolies work. They don't just shape how others see you, they shape how you see yourself. But here's the truth about monopoly power. It doesn't last forever. And India, quietly but relentlessly, dismantled it. The day the West lost its grip on India wasn't when India stopped being colonized. It was when India stopped being defined. Let's look at how the narrative shifted and who lost control because of it. 1. The collapse of the savior complex. For decades, Western institutions positioned themselves as helpers. Aid programs, think tanks, NGOs, editorial boards, all pushing the idea that India needed saving, that it needed Western guidance to become modern. But India didn't need saving. It needed sovereignty, not just in territory, but in thought. And once it stopped accepting the role of recipient, the Western savior story lost its audience. When India rejected the conditional aid, the unsolicited advice, and the moral lectures, it wasn't just policy. It was a message. We don't need to be rescued. We've already started building. 2, media control cracked open. For decades, Western media outlets dominated the global conversation. Their headlines set the tone. Their images of slums, poverty, and dysfunction shaped how the world saw India. But something happened. The rise of Indian digital media, independent creators, and unapologetic voices from within the country started painting a different picture of resilience, growth, and strength. Not propaganda, perspective, balanced, local, intelligent. When the BBC's narrative began facing scrutiny in India itself, when Indian readers stopped blindly accepting what The Guardian or the New York Times had to say about their country, that was the shift. India stopped outsourcing its self-image, and that was revolutionary. 3, education and intellectual recalibration. The West exported not just products, but paradigms. It wrote the history books, framed the theory, and decided what progress looked like. Indian education was soaked in it, celebrating Macaulay's vision more than its own indigenous thinkers. But a new wave of intellectual awakening is breaking that pattern. India is reclaiming its philosophical roots, its scientific legacy, its civilizational depth. When Indian thinkers began reinterpreting policy, economics, and geopolitics through Indian frameworks, not Western templates, it cracked the last stronghold of Western narrative dominance the mind. India isn't imitating, it's influencing. Western companies are adapting Indian models. Tech giants are learning from UPI. Global health discussions are citing Indian wellness systems. And when influence shifts, the narrative follows. 5, owning the mic today, Indians are not waiting for permission to speak. They're leading global organizations, shaping technology, hosting G20 summits, and walking into rooms as equals, not assistants. And perhaps more importantly, the diaspora, once quiet, careful, deferential, is now vocal, proud, and shaping the narrative from inside boardrooms and film studios. The West no longer owns the mic. The story has new authors. So what changed? Everything. The monopoly on India's image, voice, and role has shattered. The West no longer gets to say who India is. That power is now back where it belongs, in Indian hands. And once a country controls its own story, it becomes unstoppable. That's why this was the second death blow to Western control. They lost the power to define us. And without that power, nothing else holds. That was the end of the narrative monopoly. That was the day India stopped being a chapter in someone else's book and started writing its own. Power doesn't just shift when someone loses it. It shifts when someone claims it. For decades, India's strength was underestimated. Not because it wasn't there, but because it was buried. Buried under centuries of foreign rule, external influence, borrowed models, and self-doubt. But the moment India stopped outsourcing its potential and started unlocking what was already within, the real shift happened. And that was the rise of indigenous power, power that comes from within, not borrowed from outside. Let's break that down. 1, from dependence to self-reliance, not just a slogan, a movement. For years, the West conditioned India to think progress came from outside. Foreign investment, foreign technology, foreign institutions. But something changed when India began saying, we'll build it ourselves. Atmanirbhar Bharat wasn't just an economic policy, it was a mindset revolution. Suddenly, startups weren't copying Silicon Valley, they were solving Indian problems with Indian logic. Agritech, edtech, fintech, built by Indians, for Indians, in Indian conditions. Companies like Zerodha, Bharat Biotech, and Ola Electric proved one thing. We don't need to import success. We can manufacture it. And when India created its own COVID vaccine at scale and faster than most Western countries, the world had no choice but to take notice. That wasn't just health infrastructure. That was power. Indigenous, scalable, undeniable power. 2, homegrown innovation that doesn't apologize. In the past, indigenous was seen as rustic, less polished, less effective. But now India is proving that innovation rooted in local wisdom can outcompete even the most glamorous Western models. Take the digital public infrastructure DPI, Aadhaar, and DigiLocker. The world had Apple Pay and Google Wallet. India had UPI, and suddenly 1.3 billion people had access to frictionless finance, often with just a thumbprint. While the West debated privacy, scalability, and monopolies, India executed at scale with clarity and inclusiveness. Today, developing nations want to copy India's tech stack, not the West. The West because India's solutions are practical, affordable, and real. That's indigenous power, creating systems that work, where the West only theorized. 3. The spiritual and cultural reawakening India's power isn't just technological or economic, it's civilizational. For too long, India's spiritual legacy was repackaged and sold back to it, from mindfulness apps to yoga retreats, led by people who couldn't pronounce the Sanskrit names of the poses. But now India is reclaiming it. Not with arrogance, but with quiet, unshakable authority. Yoga is Indian. Ayurveda is Indian. The world's fascination with meditation, breathwork, and Dharma, that's India's gift, not its weakness. Cultural power is real power because it shapes how people feel, think, and live. And when the world begins to aspire to what you've always had, that's a reversal of centuries of suppression. 4, political independence was just the beginning. Mental independence is the revolution. India has been politically free since 1947, but true freedom, mental freedom, began when Indians started believing they could lead on their own terms. That's what we're seeing today. A young, unapologetic generation that's not afraid to challenge legacy systems, question old loyalties, or reject the idea that foreign is always better. From homegrown creators on YouTube challenging Western media narratives to rural entrepreneurs running solar microgrids off the beaten path, to the Indian Space Research Organization, ISRO, landing a mission near the moon's south pole, something no Western nation had done. This isn't symbolic, this is structural. And it's happening from the ground up. 5. What this means. India no longer needs a crutch. Indigenous power is about not needing permission, not needing validation. It's about knowing your systems, your culture, your intelligence are enough, not because someone told you so, but because you proved it. That's what happened when India went from being the world's back office to becoming the brain, the builder, and the leader. And here's the truth. The West is just beginning to realize you can't control a nation that doesn't need you anymore. India isn't rising because of handouts or borrowed ideas. India is rising because it remembered who it was. And that, right there, was the moment of no return. For centuries, the center of global economic gravity was anchored in the West, first in Europe, then in America. They didn't just lead economies, they designed the rules. They created the financial systems, set the trade standards, issued the dominant currencies, and dictated the flow of investment. But here's the truth they didn't expect to face, that gravity is shifting, and it's not subtle, it's tilting, fast, firm, and permanently toward India. This isn't about projections. It's not a maybe. It's already happening, and the West is watching, not from the driver's seat, but from the passenger side, struggling to understand how it lost control. Let's break down what this shift really looks like and why it's irreversible. 1. India, from emerging market to unignorable power. Once dismissed as potential, India is now performance. Once seen as a support system, India is now central infrastructure. In 2023, India officially became the world's 5th largest economy, overtaking the UK, its former colonial ruler. Symbolic? Yes, but also deeply real. Because that wasn't a one-time spike. It was momentum. With a youthful population, rising disposable income, a booming middle class, and the world's largest talent pipeline, India isn't the next big thing. It is the big thing. And investors know it. Global companies are not just outsourcing to India, they're building for India, with India, inside India. 2. Manufacturing the new world. Literally, for decades, China was the world's factory, but cracks in that model have started to show. Geopolitical tensions, supply chain instability, rising labor costs. Enter India. Under Make in India, the country has quietly become a manufacturing powerhouse. From iPhones to semiconductors, India is scaling up rapidly. Apple began shifting production from China to India. Tata is building semiconductor fabs, and global giants like Samsung, Boeing, and Foxconn are betting billions on Indian soil. This is no longer just about cheap labor. It's about strategic leverage. The West can't afford to ignore India because India now builds what the world consumes. 3. A digital economy that redefines inclusion. Here's where the gravity shift becomes undeniable. While Western economies are stuck debating cashless systems, privacy, and infrastructure access, India already built the world's most inclusive digital economy. Over 400 million Indians transact daily using UPI, a system more advanced than anything the US or EU has managed at scale. It's free, it's instant, it's secure, and it's public infrastructure, not owned by a corporation, but the people. This isn't just tech. It's economic empowerment. Farmers, shopkeepers, students, all integrated into the economy with a few taps. India skipped over the credit card era and landed straight in the future. That leap wasn't just economic, it was civilizational. 4. Redrawing the trade map, India's assertiveness in trade deals shows another truth. The country is no longer willing to play by outdated rules. India is making deals with the UAE in rupees. It's signing strategic agreements across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia, not as a junior partner, but as a peer. The West expects compliance. What it's now facing is competition. India is refusing lopsided trade deals, walking away from exploitative terms and negotiating on equal footing. That's not arrogance, that's maturity. And that's what happens when your economy stops needing approval and starts commanding respect. 5, where the investment flows, so does power. Global capital follows opportunity. And right now, India is the opportunity. It's not just FDI, it's venture capital, sovereign wealth, green tech, startups, infrastructure, in sectors like renewable energy, AI, climate innovation, and EVs. India is where the next 30 years of growth is being written. And when the money flows east, the influence follows. This is the power shift the West can't reverse. The West held power because it held the money. But India is now generating its own and redefining what wealth looks like. Wealth that's inclusive, digital, resilient, and scalable. This isn't a cycle, it's a pivot, a turning point. And it marked the day the West lost its financial grip because India no longer needs its banks, its blueprints, or its validation. The gravity has shifted, and the world's center of economic power now wears a different face. Bold, brown, and unmistakably Indian. Let's be honest, for most of modern history, India wasn't just treated as a subordinate in geopolitics, it often acted like one. It was expected to pick a side, stay in line, obey the rules written in Washington, Brussels, or London. But that chapter is over. Strategic sovereignty is the new headline, and it's shaking the global order. Because when a country like India stops playing someone else's game and starts setting the terms, the power map doesn't just shift, it cracks wide open. This is the India the West didn't see coming. Not aggressive, not reckless, but quietly assertive, fiercely independent, and absolutely unshakable in its self-interest. Let's unpack what that sovereignty looks like and why it was the fifth nail in the coffin of Western control. 1, the power to say no and mean it. In the old world order, India was often pressured into compliance by Western allies, by global media, by elite institutions and think tanks. But now, India isn't afraid to say no. When the West demanded India fall in line on sanctions against Russia, India refused, not to be rebellious, but because India's interests come first. It bought discounted oil, secured its energy needs, and reinvested those savings into domestic development without apology. This was a watershed moment because saying no without consequences used to be a privilege of the West. Now, India owns that power too. And it sent a message that couldn't be ignored. We are not your instrument. We are a force in our own right. 2, multi-alignment, not non-alignment. For decades, India was associated with the non-aligned movement. But today's India isn't neutral. It's strategically multi-aligned. India partners with the U.S. on tech and defense. It engages Russia on energy. It counters China with strategic depth in the Indo-Pacific. It leads South-South cooperation with Africa and Latin America. And it hosts G20 summits that actually matter. That's not confusion. That's calculated flexibility. While the West is stuck in binary thinking, East versus West, democracy versus autocracy, India is building bridges on its own terms. This isn't fence sitting. It's fence building. India doesn't need a protector because it has become a pivot. 3, diplomacy that's rooted in confidence, not compliance. Strategic sovereignty is most visible in diplomacy. Gone are the days when Indian leaders appeared hesitant on the world stage. Today, India negotiates with a straight spine, whether it's at the UN, WTO, or in bilateral summits. Its diplomats don't apologize for its positions. They defend them with clarity. And when foreign leaders criticize, India responds, not with anger, but with facts, pride, and poise. This is soft power with a steel core. Respect is not requested, it's commanded. 4, border defense with backbone. India's sovereignty isn't just strategic, it's also territorial. Take the border standoff with China in Galwan. India didn't just stand its ground. It changed its entire military posture. Roads were built, troop presence intensified, global awareness raised, and it did all this without dragging the West in as a crutch. This wasn't about escalation. It was about asserting the right to defend on its own terms with its own resources. When a nation no longer depends on others to defend its sovereignty, that's the moment it becomes untouchable. 5. Technology and cyber sovereignty. Strategic power today also lives in digital space. Data, cyber control, and digital infrastructure. India has asserted its sovereignty by building its own digital stack. Aadhaar, UPI, regulating foreign apps, pushing for indigenous semiconductors, and refusing to be digitally colonized again. Western big tech doesn't dictate terms here. India sets its own rules. This is why global tech CEOs take India seriously, not out of charity, but necessity. The real message to the world: strategic sovereignty isn't a tactic. It's a transformation in posture. India no longer waits to be included. It includes itself by force of relevance. And when a country this big, this young, this resourceful starts charting its own path, there is no going back. That was the 5th crack in the foundation of Western control. India no longer needs alignment to be powerful. It is powerful because it aligns with itself. Power doesn't always roar with tanks or trillions. Sometimes it flows through songs, stories, and symbols. And for the longest time, the world consumed Indian culture, but not from India. Yoga was taught in LA. Indian philosophy was quoted in TED Talks by non-Indian. Meditation apps sold Vedic breathing in English accents. Bollywood was seen as niche, and Sanskrit was treated like an ancient curiosity, not a living source of wisdom. But now, everything's changed. India has reclaimed its culture, and with that reclamation came something far more threatening to the West than missiles or markets: narrative power. Let's break it down. 1. The world is consuming Indian culture. Authentically, there's a difference between cultural appropriation and cultural ascension. For decades, Indian culture was used as spice, a sprinkle of exoticism to flavor Western stories. But now, Indian voices are telling Indian stories on Indian platforms, and the world is listening. From global music charts filled with Indian beats to Netflix and Prime pushing series with Indian leads, Indian languages, and Indian mythologies to films like RRR winning international awards, not because they mimic Hollywood, but because they refuse to mimic. India's cultural exports are no longer diluted. They're defiant, proudly Indian, and they're being embraced without compromise. This is not cultural fusion. This is cultural dominance, done gracefully. Its history rewritten, its philosophies cherry-picked, its contributions minimized. The British, for instance, portrayed India as backward, chaotic, and dependent, a land civilized by colonization. But now, India is rewriting the script. From YouTube channels breaking down real Indian history to best-selling books on ancient Indian science, dharmic thought, and philosophy, to scholars and creators unapologetically explaining Vedas, Upanishads, and Ramayana with precision and pride. India is no longer waiting for validation. It's owning the narrative on its own terms. And when you control the narrative, you control perception. And when you control perception, you control influence. 3, the Dharma Renaissance. This isn't just pop culture. This is a civilizational revival. Young Indians across the world are reconnecting with Sanskrit, chanting mantras, celebrating Indian festivals with intention, and reading ancient texts not as rituals, but as roadmaps. And unlike the past, they're not doing it in silence or shame. They're broadcasting it, teaching it, wearing it, living it. This spiritual confidence, not loud, not militant, but deeply rooted, is the West's soft power nightmare, because for decades, Western spiritualism fed off Indian wisdom while mocking its origin. Now that pipeline is being reclaimed at the source. India is no longer the borrower, it's the lighthouse. 4. Indian diaspora, global, proud, and loud. The Indian diaspora, once told to assimilate, blend in, soften their accent, change their names, is now leading boardrooms, creating billion-dollar companies, and shaping global culture with their full Indian identity intact. Sundar Pichai, Satya Nadella, Rishi Sunak, Kamala Harris, but also poets, rappers, designers, chefs, professors, and they're not trying to be Western anymore. They're expanding what global looks like, with India at the center of it. This is diaspora as amplifier, turning Indian culture into global currency. 5. Soft power as the silent superweapon. Hard power gets attention, but soft power wins minds. It's not about tanks, it's about textbooks. Not about warships, but worship. When countries admire your wisdom, celebrate your holidays, learn your language, and quote your philosophy, without you needing to push, that's undeniable power. And India is now the soft power engine that others try to imitate, but cannot replicate. Because this isn't manufactured, it's authentic, ancient, and still alive. The West once exported power through media, education, and culture. But India is now offering something the West cannot: depth, continuity, and soul. When the world starts looking to India not just for goods or code, but for guidance, that's not influence, that's civilizational gravity. This was the final crack, when the world turned to India not to learn trends, but truths. And on that day, the West didn't just lose control, it lost the story. And the storyteller is now unmistakably, unapologetically Indian. And so